The morning her father called to say she needed to come home, Petra was in the middle of a 12-hour shift at Vancouver General. She almost didn't answer. Her phone buzzed twice against the staff locker room bench, and she glanced at the screen, saw Dad, home, and felt that familiar tightening in her chest. The one that had lived there since she was 17, and learned that her father's phone calls never meant good news. They meant someone needed something. They meant she was about to be asked to give up something else. She let it ring through once, then called him back on her break. "Your grandfather's estate," he said, before she even finished saying hello. "There are decisions being made. You need to be here, Petra." "Dad, I have 4 more hours on shift, and then I'm back in at 6 tomorrow morning." "Petra." His voice dropped to that particular register she'd grown up fearing. Not loud, never loud. Just final. "I'm not asking." She drove the 7 hours to Kelowna the following Saturday with her scrubs still in a bag in the back seat and a coffee going cold in the cup holder. The Okanagan Valley opened up around her like it always did. Those wide, pale hills, the lake glinting in the distance, the orchards just starting to come back after winter. And she felt the specific grief of someone returning to a place they'd once loved before it became complicated. Her grandfather, Raymond Ellsworth, had passed 3 weeks earlier, quietly in his sleep, in the house he'd built on 12 acres outside of town. He was 81. He had been, in Petra's estimation, the only member of her family who had ever looked at her and seen exactly who she was without trying to reshape her into something more convenient. He had also, apparently, left something behind in his will that her father wasn't telling her about over the phone. The house smelled like cedar and old books when she arrived. Her mother, Diane, met her at the door with a hug that lasted slightly too long, the kind that telegraphed apology before any words did. "Your father's in the study," she said. "Of course he is." Her father, Gordon, was standing behind the desk that had once been her grandfather's. He looked older than she remembered from Christmas. There were 2 other people in the room, the family lawyer, a woman named Therese, who Petra vaguely recognized, and a man she didn't recognize at all, sitting in the wingback chair near the window with his back slightly turned. When he shifted to look at her, she saw the cane resting against the armrest, and then she saw his face, early 30s she guessed, sharp-featured, with the careful stillness of someone who was very used to being looked at and very much wished he weren't. "Petra," her father said, "this is Wyatt Calloway." She waited for more. None came. "Okay," she said carefully. "Hi." The man Wyatt gave her a brief nod. He didn't smile. He also didn't look away, which she found vaguely unnerving. His eyes were dark and very steady. "Sit down," Gordon said. "Therese is going to walk us through the terms of the will." What Therese walked them through, in the calm, measured language of someone who had clearly delivered stranger news in her career, was this. Raymond Ellsworth had left the estate. The house, the 12 acres, the orchard, not directly to Gordon, as everyone had assumed, but to Petra, with one condition. She had to be married within 60 days of the reading of the will, or the estate would pass to a conservation trust. Petra stared at the document Therese had slid across the desk. Then she looked at her father. Then at the man in the wingback chair. "No," she said. "Petra. No, absolutely not. Dad, this is..." She stopped. Tried again. "Why would Grandpa do this?" Gordon's jaw tightened. He had his reasons. What reasons? What possible? He felt, Therese said, with the diplomatic smoothness of someone steering a car away from a ditch, that you had been, in his words, too focused on surviving to remember how to live. He wanted to give you a reason to stop. Petra was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the last conversation she'd had with her grandfather, 6 months before he died. She'd driven up for his birthday, and they'd sat on the porch after dinner, watching the light go down over the lake, and he'd asked her, out of nowhere, if she was happy. She'd said yes automatically, and he'd looked at her with those gray eyes, that particular Raymond Ellsworth look that had always meant "I know you better than that," and he hadn't pushed it. He'd just reached over and patted her hand. She had not cried until she was back on the highway heading south. "Who is he?" she asked, nodding toward Wyatt. "He's the son of my business partner," Gordon said. "Harlan Calloway. You've met Harlan." She had, vaguely. A tall man with a booming voice who came to her parents' Christmas party sometimes. "So this is, what? A business arrangement. It doesn't have to be complicated, Dad." She kept her voice very level. "I'm a nurse. I work 60 hours a week. I have a lease in Vancouver that runs until September. I have a life." "You have a career," Gordon said. "There's a difference." She wanted to throw something. She didn't. Instead, she turned to look at Wyatt Calloway, who had, throughout this entire conversation, said nothing. He was watching the window now, his expression unreadable. "What do you get out of this?" she asked him directly. He turned. Those steady eyes again. Nothing I'm willing to explain in this room, he said. It was the most honest thing anyone had said since she'd walked in. She didn't agree that night. She drove to her parents' house, slept in her childhood bedroom, and lay awake on a mattress that still had the same faded blue duvet cover she'd had at 16, staring at the ceiling and trying to find the version of this situation that made any kind of sense. Her grandfather had loved her. She knew that. She also knew that Raymond Ellsworth had been, in his gentle way, a man who did things for reasons, who didn't make gestures without intention. He had built everything he had from scratch. Had given her father the kind of comfortable life that Gordon had somehow never quite managed to feel grateful for. And he had spent the last years of his life watching Petra move through the world, like someone who had forgotten she was allowed to want things. She thought about what Therese had read from the will. Too focused on surviving to remember how to live. She hated that it landed. In the morning she called her supervisor and arranged coverage for the following week. Then she texted Therese and said she wanted to talk to Wyatt Calloway alone before she made any decision. They met at a coffee shop on the edge of town, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and local art on the walls. He was already there when she arrived, the cane hooked over the back of his chair, both hands around a mug. He looked different outside the study, less formal, more tired. "You didn't have to do this the way my father wanted," she said, sitting down. "You could have said no. So could you? I'm considering it, I know." He didn't seem bothered by this. She ordered a tea she didn't particularly want and looked at him. Up close she could see a faint scar along his left jawline, the kind that had clearly once been significant and had faded to something almost invisible with time. "What happened?" she asked before she'd decided to. He glanced at her. Then, to her surprise, he said, "Skiing accident. 7 years ago. Spinal injury. I can walk with the cane on good days. On bad days I use a chair. I'm sorry, don't be. It's just information." She liked that, actually, the plainness of it. Most people either performed discomfort or overcorrected into performative ease when disability came up. He just stated it like he was telling her the weather. "Why does your father want this?" she asked. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "My father and your grandfather had a partnership that was not uncomplicated. There are some business interests tied to the Ellsworth estate. My father wants them managed by someone who will be cooperative. And you're supposed to be the cooperative mechanism. In theory. Are you?" He looked at her steadily. "I'm here having coffee with a stranger instead of being in my office in Calgary, so I suppose that's a kind of cooperation." She almost smiled. Almost. "I'm not going to quit nursing," she said. "I'm not asking you to. I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not good. And I want to understand clearly what this arrangement actually is, what we're each getting, what we're each giving up. No vagueness." He nodded slowly. "That seems fair." "Okay," she said, and heard herself adding, without quite planning to, "Then I'll think about it." The wedding was small. City Hall in Kelowna, a Tuesday in April, gray sky pressing low over the mountains. Her mother cried. Her father stood very straight and looked like a man who had gotten what he wanted and wasn't sure how to feel about it. Wyatt wore a dark suit. Petra wore a dress she'd bought off the rack at a boutique on Bernard Avenue because she'd refused to spend a week looking for something she didn't feel. She'd called her best friend Saoirse the night before. Saoirse, who was also a nurse, and who had known Petra since they were both 19-year-old students sharing a flat in Victoria, and who had the particular gift of being able to say, "Are you absolutely out of your mind? And I'm coming to get you if you need me," in the same breath. "Tell me this is what you want," Saoirse said. "I don't know what it is yet," Petra said honestly, "but I'm doing it. Okay, then I'm in your corner." "But Petra, the second it stops feeling right, you call me. I know, promise me. I promise." She'd felt calmer after that. Not certain calm. There was a difference she'd learned to appreciate over years of working in emergency medicine. Certainty was a luxury. Calm was something you could actually use. The estate was hers on paper by end of business that day. And 3 weeks after the wedding, Wyatt drove his car up from Calgary with 2 boxes and a dog, a large, gray-muzzled shepherd mix named Birch, who immediately went to investigate every corner of the property with the thoroughness of a building inspector. Petra had driven back up from Vancouver the day before, her own car loaded with the things she'd decided she couldn't live without, and the half-formed plan of doing this one season at a time. She'd transferred to the Kelowna General float pool. It wasn't Vancouver General, but it was work, and it was hers, and she'd fought too hard to build her competence in a room to abandon it for a house, no matter how much she loved the house. They were polite with each other in those first weeks, careful. Petra learned that Wyatt made coffee early, and always made enough for 2, which she found she appreciated even before she'd admitted it. He worked remotely, something in commercial real estate development, and kept his office door mostly closed. Birch claimed the rug in front of the fireplace as sovereign territory and regarded Petra with the slow, regal interest of a creature deciding whether she was worthy. She started coming home from shifts and sitting on the porch, watching the valley in the last of the light, and found that she was, for the first time in years, actually sitting. Not decompressing to go back. Not resting to function. Just sitting, in the way her grandfather used to. One evening Wyatt came out with 2 beers and handed her one without asking. "Bad shift?" he said. "Long." She looked at the can. "Thank you." He sat in the other chair. Birch came and settled between them. "My grandfather used to do this," she said after a while. "Sit out here after dinner. I used to think it was an old person thing. That you had to earn it somehow." "Earn what?" "Stillness." Wyatt was quiet. "Then, I used to think I'd earn it when the business hit a certain number. Then when I could walk without the cane more days than not. Then when—" He stopped. "Kept moving the line," she said. "Me too." The complication came in July when a man named Frederick Langham arrived. She'd never met him, but she knew the name. Frederick Langham was the managing director of a development company that had been trying to purchase part of the Ellsworth property for 3 years. Specifically, the 16 acres adjacent to the orchard that her grandfather had held as agricultural reserve. The conservation trust clause in the will, it turned out, had less to do with Petra's romantic life and rather more to do with blocking Frederick Langham. Her grandfather had explained this in a letter she found in the estate's filing cabinet in late June, tucked inside a folder marked simply "Read when you're ready." "I know how your father operates," Raymond had written. "I know he would have sold before the ink was dry. I needed it to go to someone with more patience. I'm sorry for the theater of the thing. You always hated theater. But I needed you there, and I needed you to have a reason to stay long enough to understand what you were protecting. The land matters, Petra. The orchard matters. Don't let Frederick take it, and while you're at it, stop running. You're very good at it, but it doesn't suit you." She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it back. She told Wyatt that evening. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to recognize as a particular quality of his. The ability to actually hold space for what was being said, instead of preparing his response in the middle of it. "Langham's been in contact with my father," he said when she finished. She looked at him. "Not recently," he added. Before all of this. My father had interest in the project. I didn't know the full scope until about a month ago." "What changed a month ago?" "I started reading the actual documents." She was quiet for a long moment. And it's not something I want to be part of." He held her gaze. "Which is not something my father is particularly happy about. Is that why you agreed to this? To stop your father from dealing with Langham through the estate?" "Partly." A pause. "And partly because your grandfather asked me to." She sat very still. "He wrote to me 6 months before he died. I'd met him twice, years ago, through my father. He reached out. Said he had a granddaughter who'd forgotten how to stop moving and a property that needed someone steady, and asked if I'd consider being part of the solution." Wyatt looked at the table. "I thought it was a strange thing to ask. Then I thought about my own life. And I said yes." Petra didn't know what to do with that. It was too much to process in a single sitting. So she did the thing she'd been learning all spring. She let it settle without grabbing for it. "Okay," she said finally. "Then we deal with Langham." "We deal with Langham," he agreed. Dealing with Langham turned out to be less dramatic than she'd expected and more exhausting. It involved 3 meetings with Therese, a lengthy review of the agricultural land reserve regulations, and one deeply unpleasant phone call during which Frederick Langham explained, in the tone of a man who had never been told no by anyone he considered relevant, that there were creative ways to structure the sale that the Conservation Trust clause wouldn't catch. Petra had, by that point, done enough reading to know exactly what he meant, and she had, by that point, enough anger to be very calm about it. "The land isn't for sale," she said. "I don't think you'll find a structure that changes that, but I encourage you to try." She hung up before he could respond. She told Wyatt afterward, expecting, she wasn't sure what, some version of well done that felt transactional. What she got instead was him setting down his coffee and starting to laugh quietly and genuinely, and Birch lifting his head in sleepy inquiry from the rug. It was, she realized, the first time she'd heard him actually laugh. Her father came in August. She'd known he would. Gordon Ellsworth did not simply accept outcomes that contradicted his expectations. He drove up on a Wednesday, unannounced, and stood in the kitchen of his father's house with the expression of a man inventorying what he'd lost. "You're going to hold on to this place," he said. "Not a question." "Yes. The orchard hasn't turned a profit in 4 years. I know, I'm working on that. And Calloway is my husband, she said, and not your concern. Gordon looked at her for a long moment. She'd spent her whole life trying to decode that look, trying to find the version of herself that would satisfy whatever it was he needed from her. She'd given up a lot of things in the attempt, opportunities, relationships, entire chapters of herself she'd packed quietly into boxes and put in storage because he'd made her feel that what she wanted and what was sensible were mutually exclusive. Your grandfather left everything to you, Gordon said finally. Did you know he and I argued about that? For the last 2 years? No. He said I didn't need it. He said you did. His jaw moved. I didn't understand what he meant. She waited. I think I'm starting to, he said. It wasn't an apology. She didn't think her father had the language for the kind of apology this would require, but it was something, a crack in the wall. She'd take it. After he left, she stood on the porch and watched his car go down the long gravel drive and felt something she hadn't expected. Not victory. Something quieter. Something closer to grief and gratitude mixed together, the way things often were when they were real. Wyatt came out at some point and stood beside her. You okay? He said. Yeah. She watched the dust settle from the driveway. He's not a bad person. He just learned very early that the only way to matter was to take up space, and he passed that down. She paused. I spent a long time running from it. My grandfather was right. I was very good at running. You're not running right now, she looked at him. He was watching the valley, the lake glinting in the late afternoon light. Birch, leaning against his leg. No, she said, I'm not. In September, she extended her transfer to Kelowna permanently. She called Saworsay to tell her, and Saworsay cried a little, and said she was already planning to drive up for Thanksgiving. And Petra said she'd make pie, and Saworsay said you've never made pie in your life. And Petra said there's a lot of things I've never done that I'm starting to do. And they both laughed. The orchard had its first profitable weekend market stand in October. Small, just 2 tables at the farmer's market in town, apples and late pears and some squash she'd grown in the kitchen garden almost by accident. She made $47 and felt an absurd amount of pride about it. Wyatt drove her home, and she spent the whole way back talking about what she wanted to try next spring, varieties she'd been reading about, whether it was worth having someone come in to look at the irrigation system. He didn't say much. He listened, the way he always did, and at some point she noticed she wasn't performing the conversation, wasn't editing herself for palatability, wasn't measuring how much enthusiasm was appropriate. She was just talking, and he was just there, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world. That night, after dinner, Birch had fallen asleep by the fire and the kitchen was warm with the smell of the meal, and the windows had gone dark with evening. Wyatt looked up from his book and said, I'd like to stay. She set down her mug. The arrangement, he said, was 60 days and then, open-ended. I want to be clear that I'm not assuming anything. He paused. I'd like to stay, if that's something you'd want. She thought about her grandfather, sitting on this porch all those years watching the lake, having built everything around him from something and chosen not to run from any of it. She thought about a Tuesday in April and a city hall and a dress off the rack, and the particular feeling of stepping toward something she didn't have a map for. She thought about how long she'd kept moving the line. Yeah, she said. I'd like that too. Outside, the valley was dark and quiet and very wide, and the orchard stood in it, hers held, not given away. And somewhere in the distance the lake was doing what it always did, which was simply existing, patient and enormous and entirely unbothered by the small human decisions being made on its shore.